For 45 years, two superpowers fought a war without ever firing a single bullet at each other. No tank ever fired directly at the other side. No fighter jets clashed head-on in open combat. And yet, the world never came closer to ending. One button press. That's all it would have taken to wipe out life on Earth as we know it. This is a story of spies, of coups that toppled governments overnight, of an agency so secretive that even presidents feared what it knew. This is the story of the CIA. For 45 years, the world held its breath. And by the end of this video, you'll understand just how many times we came within minutes of nuclear extinction, without ever knowing it. This is the Cold War's untold story. And trust me, what you think you know is only a fraction of what actually happened. Let's rewind to 1947. World War II was over. Hitler was dead. But a new kind of monster was being born. An ideological war unlike anything the world had seen. On one side stood the United States. Capitalism, democracy, the promise of freedom. On the other stood the Soviet Union. Communism, control, and a government that spied on its own people as much as it did its enemies. Both superpowers now had the atomic bomb. Both had the power to erase each other from the map. But there was one thing neither side had: trust. And where trust disappears, espionage is born. On July 26, 1947, U.S. President Harry Truman signed a single document, the National Security Act. That one signature gave birth to the world's most powerful and most secretive intelligence agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. Officially, the CIA's job was to gather intelligence and assess foreign threats. But unofficially, it quickly became America's most dangerous weapon, a force capable of toppling entire governments without ever declaring war. In 1953, Iran. In 1954, Guatemala. The CIA proved it didn't need an army. Just a handful of agents, some money, and a well-engineered political crisis could redraw the map of any nation. The world had no idea who was really pulling the strings. And that was the CIA's greatest strength: invisibility. Behind closed doors, the CIA was building something unprecedented. A network of spies, informants, and operatives spanning nearly every continent. Budgets were hidden inside other government programs. Operations were approved with nothing more than a verbal nod from the president, leaving no paper trail behind. If something went wrong, there was plausible deniability. The government could simply claim it never happened. This wasn't just an intelligence agency. It was becoming a parallel government, one that operated outside the normal checks and balances that were supposed to keep democracy honest. But this was only the beginning. The real test was still to come, and it would arrive in a country where communism and democracy would collide for the first time. On an actual battlefield, Korea had been split into two: North Korea, backed by the Soviets and communist, and South Korea, backed by the United States and democratic. On June 25th, North Korea invaded the South, and suddenly the Cold War wasn't so cold anymore. For the first time, US and Soviet-backed forces were facing each other directly on a battlefield, even though officially the two superpowers weren't at war with one another. This was the birth of the proxy war, where major powers don't fight each other directly, but instead fight through others. For the CIA, Korea became a massive intelligence test. They had to track North Korean and Chinese troop movements, infiltrate agents behind enemy lines, and hunt for evidence of direct Soviet involvement. But here, the CIA made its first major mistake. In October 1950, as US-led forces pushed deep into North Korea, the CIA assessed that China would not intervene. That assessment turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Chinese forces launched a massive counteroffensive. Thousands of American soldiers were killed. It was a brutal wake-up call. Intelligence agencies can be wrong, and when they are, it's soldiers and ordinary people who pay the price. The Korean War ended in 1953 in a stalemate. No clear winner. But one thing became painfully clear. The Cold War would no longer be confined to spies and secret meetings. It would spill real blood, take real lives, all without ever being called an official war. And if you think Korea was dangerous, wait. Because the next chapter of this story would push the entire world to within 13 days of nuclear apocalypse. After Korea, a new and far more terrifying game began: the arms race. Both superpowers threw themselves into a relentless competition to build more nuclear weapons than the other. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. From that day on, the world understood no single nation would ever hold this power alone again. By the 1950s, both countries had stockpiled enough nuclear weapons to wipe out humanity many times over. Out of this madness came a doctrine known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The logic was brutally simple. If one superpower launched a nuclear attack on the other, both would be annihilated. There would be no winner, only ashes. It was a strange paradox. The more destructive power each side accumulated, the more terrified they became of ever using it. Fear itself became the guarantee of peace. This is where the CIA's role became even more critical. They needed to know exactly how many missiles the Soviets had, where they were positioned, and how quickly they could be launched. A single miscalculation could push the world one step closer to World War III. U-2 spy planes, satellite imagery, deep cover agents. The CIA used every method available to track Soviet nuclear capability. And this intelligence would soon prove decisive, in a moment when the entire world stood on the very edge of nuclear war. October 1962. A U-2 spy plane, operated by the CIA, flew high above Cuba, capturing aerial photographs. What those images revealed shocked the entire world. The Soviet Union had secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States mainland. Think about that for a moment. Nuclear weapons close enough that, if launched, they could obliterate Washington, D.C. within minutes. No warning time, no chance to escape. President John F. Kennedy faced three options: ignore it, which was essentially suicidal; launch a military strike on Cuba, which risked triggering full-scale nuclear war; or impose a naval blockade and negotiate. Kennedy chose the third path, but the world had no idea what was unfolding behind closed doors. The CIA and U.S. intelligence were tracking Soviet ships in real time, desperately trying to answer one question: would the Soviets cross the blockade? Was this the beginning of war? For 13 days, the entire world held its breath. And then came the most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War, one that remained classified for decades. On October 27, 1962, a Soviet submarine B-59 found itself surrounded by U.S. naval forces. They had no communication with Moscow. They believed war had already begun. The submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. Launching it required approval from 3 officers. 2 of them were ready to fire. Only one man refused, Vasily Arkhipov. If Arkhipov had said yes, history books today wouldn't have a chapter called World War III. It would simply be reality, one man's decision, the entire future of humanity. Eventually, backdoor diplomacy prevailed. The Soviets withdrew their missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. secretly removed its own missiles from Turkey. The world survived. But it was a warning. The Cold War wasn't just a cold rivalry. It was, quite literally, a finger hovering over the button that could end the world at any moment. After the missile crisis, both superpowers changed their strategy. No more direct confrontation. From here on, the war would be fought in the shadows, in jungles, in a place called Vietnam. Officially, the Vietnam War was a civil war. North Vietnam, communist and backed by the Soviets and China, against South Vietnam, backed by the United States. But in reality, it was once again a proxy war, a new battlefield in the Cold War. The CIA was deeply involved here, too. They ran secret operations, missions like Operation Phoenix, targeting Viet Cong infrastructure, and interrogations that are considered human rights violations by today's standards. But Vietnam wasn't just a military failure. It was the collapse of trust. When the American public discovered that their own government had been running secret operations they were never told about, and when the Pentagon papers were leaked in 1971, exposing just how much the government had lied to its own people, something changed forever. America lost its innocence. People began losing faith in their own government. And the CIA, once seen as a silent protector, began to be viewed as an agency that made its own rules and answered to no one. More than 58,000 American soldiers were killed in Vietnam. Millions of Vietnamese civilians died. And in the end, in 1975, North Vietnam won. Saigon fell. America had suffered its first major Cold War military defeat, but the CIA's covert operations weren't limited to Vietnam. Around the world, in Chile, Congo, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, the CIA was operating in the shadows, building and toppling governments, and the world often wouldn't learn the truth until decades later, if ever. This is the part the CIA wanted hidden the most. In 1953, Iran, the CIA helped overthrow the democratically elected Prime Minister, Mossadegh, simply because he tried to nationalize British oil interests. The result? Decades of instability that still shape the Middle East today. In 1961, Congo, allegations of CIA involvement in the assassination of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. In 1973, Chile, a coup against the democratically elected President Salvador Allende, one widely believed to have been backed by the CIA, that handed Chile over to a brutal dictatorship. And then, the 1980s, Afghanistan. The CIA secretly funded and trained the Afghan Mujahideen against Soviet forces through what became known as Operation Cyclone. The operation succeeded. The Soviets were defeated. But it also created networks that would later write one of the darkest chapters in global history. The very same Mujahideen networks from which groups like Al-Qaeda would eventually emerge. This is the CIA's greatest irony. The weapons and training used to create today's enemy were once given to build yesterday's ally. Every coup, every covert operation reveals the same pattern. The Cold War was never just a fight between two superpowers. It was a global chessboard, where smaller nations became pawns, and their people paid the price for decisions they never made. Now we arrive at the moment this 45-year war ended, without a single final battle. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was crumbling from within. Its economy was collapsing. So much had been spent on the arms race that ordinary citizens struggled to access even basic goods. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, tried to introduce reforms, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. But these reforms, meant to save the system, ultimately tore it apart instead. On November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The wall that had divided East and West Germany, communism and democracy, for decades, torn down by the hands of ordinary people. And then, on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. There was no nuclear war, no final battle. The world's most powerful communist empire collapsed from within without a single shot fired. The CIA itself struggled to predict this collapse. Historians still debate it today. Did the CIA know the Soviet Union would fall this quickly? Or was this yet another intelligence failure, just like Korea decades earlier? 45 years of conflict, a war that pushed the world to the brink of extinction more than once, ended not with a bang, but with a whisper. So, what can we actually learn from this entire story? First, power without accountability is always dangerous. Agencies like the CIA, operating in the shadows without answering to anyone, can make mistakes that cost millions of lives, and the world may not find out for decades. Second, the entire world sometimes survives because of one person's decision. You've probably never heard the name Vasily Arkhipov before, but a single no may have saved all of humanity. Third, the weapons networks and alliances we build today as temporary solutions can become tomorrow's biggest problems. Afghanistan is the clearest proof of that. And most important of all, the Cold War was never truly cold. Millions died in proxy wars, from Korea to Vietnam, from Guatemala to Congo. This wasn't just a fight between superpowers. It was a war fought by people who never chose to be part of it. Today, when we look back, the Cold War feels like distant history. Black and white photographs, documentaries, declassified files. But the truth is, the systems the Cold War built, the intelligence networks, the covert operations, the collapse of public trust, they still exist around us today, just under different names. Every time a government hides something in the name of national security, every time a covert operation is later exposed, every time we ask ourselves, do we really know the whole truth? We are living in the legacy of the Cold War. 45 years, standing that close to a single button, that if just one person had made a slightly different decision, you wouldn't be watching this video right now. I wouldn't be writing this script. Nothing would exist at all. So the next time you read about history, the next time you hear the word peace, remember, peace is never automatic. Peace is always fragile, and sometimes it hangs entirely on one person's single decision. The CIA's darkest secret was never just what they did. Their darkest secret was that the world never learned the full truth, and maybe, even today, we still haven't. If you enjoyed this video, hit like, share it, and let me know in the comments. Which part of the Cold War shocked you the most? Because everything you just heard is only the tip of the iceberg. There are still files locked away, missions never confirmed, and names history may never remember.